Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Today, I'm incredibly proud to announce that we're trying to do some innovative work in this area, and therefore we have sort of a double-decker today of wonderfulness. First speaking in our colloquium, of course, is Seth Frey, and you can see the topic that he's going to speak on today. And then we're going to follow it up this afternoon with Beyond the Salon series with Doc, who's suddenly in the picture.
Leading the building.
and we're going to then follow this up. So we hope if you're here, stay here. If you're not signed up for both of those, though, we highly recommend, it's not too late to sign up for the Salon series this afternoon. That's at 2 o'clock, following very much a similar pattern of topics. And so Seth needs like zero introduction is the fun part about this, because for those of you who are familiar with the Ostrom workshop, of course, Seth is well known to all of us. And so I'm going to let him just take off and begin to talk. But again, thank you for being here. We're looking forward to questions and answers, and I will cut you off.
Great.
Okay.
Yeah,
It's my obligation to cut you off.
I feel like I need a little. But I guess in brief, I'm Seth Frey. I did my PhD here, actually in the cognitive science department, and I was building a local housing cooperative up as a co-founder at the same time that I discovered the workshop. Discovered there's a science of building cooperatives, and I would bring my papers to house meetings on how to keep the kitchen sink clean. And no one listened to me. I here. And slowly I shifted my work more and more away from the kind of micro cognitive dynamics of collective behavior to the organization of institutions, trying to continue a lot of the work that made the workshop something I admire so much. And now I'm at University of California, Davis in the communication department in a very interdisciplinary program focused on computational social science approaches to institutional design, institutional structure, institutional analysis. And so, yeah, speaking of carrying the things that work. So my goal is really, I want to understand successful self-governance. I live in self-governing communities. I've run a bunch. I looked at a bunch. I care about it a lot. I was empowered by it, and I want other people to experience that. And I think the best way to do that is to use the affordances of technology and technology-based communities like online communities to scale up quantitative comparative research. I'm interested in collective outcomes as they emerge from individual behavior. So this sort of complex system story that we need all the data that all the individuals are, we need to understand what individuals are doing, and understanding how collective outcomes result from individuals is understanding institutional success. Very micro-focused. So I want to start, what are the workshop's most enduring findings? And in my opinion, most of them came from, just think for yourself, like what sticks in your head is the things that have lasted the longest and stuck in most people's heads. One is governing the commons, which was a comparative analysis of 300. Another big in my mind is the Nepal work, which is kind of invisible, but it's really valuable for understanding. It was really important for understanding, for establishing that government intervention can backfire. And that was a comparative study of about 200. And the IFRI project is a longitudinal analysis covering 40 years now, I guess. Over 80 sites. So these are all large-scale comparative analyses at the unit of analysis of the institution. And I see that as underlying everything important to me that came out of the workshop. So, and so we get to ask the question, well, if you want to study, if you're a cell biologist, you study lots of cells. If you're a psychologist, you study many individuals. So why is it not the case in pretty much every social science that social scientists don't primarily study many societies? There's a fair reason for that, and that it's hard to run the IFRI project. You need staff, you need giant grants from the Ford Foundation or wherever, and you need decades, right? So that's a little prohibitive, and so it's practicalities that keep us from doing the work that we must do, that's necessary to do we're called social, like I don't call myself a behavioral scientist. If I did, I would do the N equals 61 million Facebook, these giant individual level experiments. I'm a social scientist, so I want societies to study. And I was actually here a year and a half ago saying the same story. I'm going to sing the same tune, but with different projects. And so I think that by going online, we can get that scale we're looking for. So this is Tragedy of the Commons in action in a video game called Minecraft. Trees go down, buildings go up. Development, rules governing extraction. And so I've shared work on this in the past, so I'm not going to go into this, but this illustrates what we can do. This was based on a comparative analysis of 5,000 self-governing online communities in this one game called Minecraft. And so, we have our famous globally significant tragedies of the commons, and each of them exists in micro on the internet. So we gain a laboratory for studying collective action in general by looking at lots of online platforms, and we get that large N. So there's lots of things that commend online communities and other human engineered social systems. They produce lots of machine legible data. There are many units of analysis. They're real people, I like to say, but in a simplified environment. The environment's general enough is what I'm going to say, which is like it's not farther from physical institutions than they are from each other. Forests, fisheries, irrigation systems, totally different ecosystems. If there's anything tying them together, that's what the workshop produced, and that's theory that we can port over to online as well. Online's not so weird in the context of those things that are very weird from each other. And then lots of other things that make it easy to study. So I just always prepared too many slides. I'm going to go into a subset of these little projects that answer fun, exciting questions to me in the context of a variety of online communities. There's some video games like Minecraft and World of Warcraft is actually amazing for this. There's an online discussion forum called Reddit. There's open source software communities developing free software for the world. But if it's free, no one's getting paid, so you have a public goods provisioning problem. This is an important collective action problem online that many open source software foundations or organizations are solving in different creative ways that we can analyze. And Wikipedia and literal dozens more. So the Apache Software Foundation is one of many institutional umbrellas over open source with institutional patterns and structures that we can analyze to understand the success of these public goods problems. And here are, a couple hundred of the projects they support under one unified governance umbrella, each with their own internal operating kind of standards. There's not a Wikipedia, there's Wikipedias, about 300. These are screenshots of all the vandalism policies in about 30 Wikipedias. I'm going to start with the project comparing these. Reddit is a place where anyone can start a discussion community, and you get to write your own, and people write their own rules. And we can analyze the text of those rules. Here are some. They range from the frivolous shower thoughts. One of my parents. A shower thought is not a thought about showering. This is one of the rules. Like, if you write a thought about showering, it's off. It gets deleted. It has to be a thought while you were in the shower, and it has certain characteristics that are defined. Whereas, well, some can be very serious, right? So Reddit has this amazing diversity in terms of stakes, right? Rules matter if lives are at stake. And so we actually have the motivation in place in an environment that you might think was all, frivolous cat memes or whatever. Video game for kids with amazing institutional design by 13-year-olds. They've decomposed the problem of governance into little modules that you can install: social hierarchy, private property rights, common property regimes, monitoring or remediation of bad behavior. This video game, which is thousands of people online at once. And so some pirates who run copies of this game illegally, there's about 100 around the world. They write 30-page policy manuals, and they not only have like application procedures for becoming a moderator, they have appeal processes if you get rejected, just huge amounts of bureaucracy. They're reinventing bureaucracy at scale, and we can compare hundreds of these in parallel. There's one of them. Yeah, so I'm going to start with Wikipedia, and I want to ask, if we could just kind of reset the United States under different random conditions and replay it, would it develop the same rules in the same order over time? Or would minor deviations cause forking to lead to many different United Stateses? We don't know because we don't have that reset button. We don't get to see an instance of one community or one kind of institution developing lots of times. And if we did, we'd be able to answer fundamental questions about policy development. How much is it determined by noise, by the nature of the problem, by culture and cultural variation? So those are tough questions to ask. But the argument a little bit is that all 300 Wikipedias have to solve the same problem, but they're doing it coming from different cultures because of 300 language editions of the encyclopedia. And language means very different kinds of people. You know, even if they're all tech savvy enough to run a wiki, they're still, their brains were trained in different languages, they think differently. So how much does that influence the policy development course? Do 200 systems follow 200 paths or one path? That's the driving question of this project. I'm going to go fast because this isn't even the one that I shared the paper on, right? I'm just like sharing fun stuff. Each Wikipedia's policy system is written by the users, the same people who are writing articles are writing policies to govern those articles. Policies like notability. Should I get a Wikipedia page? I'm not tenured, but I'm published, there's some things. And there's actually like a page. Go on English Wikipedia, you'll find the rules for when academics can have their own Wikipedia page. Separate from entertainers, separate from politicians, separate from musicians. How many albums do you need before you can have a Wikipedia page? Right, so this has actually been settled. and on a consensus system, they deny it's consensus, but it's very consensus-y of millions of people. So they've developed a way that consensus scales. And they're able to do this kind of thing. So here are language editions you'd expect, although you didn't expect that Cebuano is the second largest Wikipedia. That's Cebu is one of the like third, fourth biggest island in the Philippines. But one person wrote a bot that writes all the articles. Got it. So we look at editor count when we're looking at size. You'll see me compare against size. But here's a bunch of languages you haven't heard of. Did you know there's 6 like more or less unintelligible dialects of German in Germany? I didn't know, and they all have Wikipedias. So how much do their policy networks converge, right? How much is their policy path distinguished by the fact that there is a common language of German, which did develop a distinct policy apparatus from English because it's big, it's huge, it's very active. So the data is you've seen this on especially if you're multilingual, you've been on Wikipedia, you weren't satisfied with the English language article, so you went to your native language article on that thing through the cross wiki links, which are this thing on the side, and you can see all the languages that have that article. That's used in Wikipedia articles. It's also used in the policy network. So these are all the links to all the vandalism pages across languages. There's dozens of them. And I was able, my team, some really cool people, a sociologist, an economist, and a political scientist. Sounds like a beginning of a joke. It's all just this amazing group of grad students. We scraped all the Wikipedias for the policies that they share, and we looked at what order they adopt them to answer this question. That's the network. It's just a giant ball of spaghetti. So we have 60 shared policies across 245 editions for 3,600 instances, like links basically between policies and ideas. So we get to ask who shares how many policies with who. It's actually just a giant fully connected network with a huge central core. So it means there wasn't structure there basically. But we did a lot of network analysis and we did some other stuff. I want to skip ahead to what's driving number of policies, number of admins, number of policies. So we just we're getting a nice kind of sense of institutional growth that the more people you get committed to the project at the level of maintaining its bureaucracy, not just writing its articles, the greater your policy adoption. We don't know which is causing which, obviously. I like this a lot. This is your developmental path. So this is what I want you to see is that if there's a blue dot, it means that 12 happened before, 4 happened before 12. And so what we'd expect if there's a ladder of development that you need like a notability policy before you can have an academic notability policy is this, lower half, lower corner blue, everything else white. And so what basically, there's a certain number of policies that get adopted a lot. They get adopted in a certain order. As you get more policies, it's kind of like, that Wikipedia got that policy, that one added that policy, and so on. So there's sort of this core of policies that you're going to more or less, it's not deterministic, it's fairly noisy, but there is kind of a ladder going on. That there is a certain progression you follow in the early stages. Once you reach a critical mass, then possibly you start to diverge. So we haven't gotten clear evidence of divergence beyond just like noise. We've tried, so this is called a sequence modeling, where you try to find characteristic paths through the development adoption space. I think it's noise. My colleagues are more optimistic. We haven't made up our minds yet. And really we have the popularity of a policy driving the order of adoption. That the policy adopted by the most Wikipedias is the one that tends to get adopted first, and so on. The policies that have been adopted by the fewest Wikipedias get adopted later. That might sound obvious, but it means something. It means that, especially if we're not finding cultural clusters, we actually have, they're really looking. So almost to the point, well, no, it's actually pretty responsible. They're really looking in a responsible way. So if we find all the German Wikipedias, you know, all the Spanish speaking, like developing some shared ecosystem, all the French, former French colonies, especially around Africa forming. If it's there, we'll find it. We haven't found it yet. And I'm again, not optimistic we'll find it. So my interpretation is that what's driving policy development is the needs of the collective action problem. The fact that they're all solving the same problem and the same bundle of collective action problems is what's driving the need for policy, rather than a reflection of cultural values. Now, that's a ridiculous thing to say. Certainly values and culture matter in policy development, but as it appears in this data set, as we're able to find, if it's there, it's relatively weak compared to the demands of collective action itself, the demands of a really serious problem under resource constraints. So that's a takeaway from the Wikipedia project. I'm just going to keep going. This is all work in progress. There's a million limitations and caveats. Anything you can fault, I can fault better. We have a nice, so that's a case that's a little less. Okay, now we can get into the institutional grammar, which is a nice Ostrom framework. I've been active with this amazing community of people developing computational text analysis tools for taking rule texts and automatically performing the institutional grammar decomposition. What that is it uses just the rules of syntax to map like a sentence onto the institutional onto its parts as an institution. I can show you an example of that. And we're going to use it to ask the question, how flat is a flat organization? So open source organizations in Wikipedia are arguably among large scale human social systems, the most egalitarian, the most flat that we've been able to develop. It took technology to get organizations as flat as that. And yet there's a question, as flat as they are, how flat are they really? There are little emergent oligarchies in Wikipedia, for example. So we want to ask in this ecosystem, how much authority, when you're trying not to give, to create authorities, how much authority are you creating and reinforcing, and how are you doing that? So we're going to look at the policy text, looking at the count, which anyone could do, but we're also going to look at the content of those rules. And we're going to get two lenses into how authority is instantiated and regulated relative to kind of lower level participants. How many rules shackle me as the participant versus how many rules shackle me, or what kinds of rules shackle me as some kind of authority figure. This is what I mean by the institutional grammar. This is Crawford Nostrum, 1995. It was 1995, then nothing happened. And then in the last decade or so, or 5 years or so, there's a lot of people using this tool, and we're trying to make it easier to use. You take a sentence, Each project in the process of being maturized by the umbrella must report to the project management committee. A mentor must be a project management committee member, and so on. And so these sentences we can decompose into their subject, which is like an agent that's being regulated. The object, the thing that their actions being regulated with respect to, the object of the sentence. The deontic, must, may, should, can, will, strong, weak, right? May, could, versus must, will, yeah? And then names the verb, and this is what kinds of behaviors are being regulated. So once we extract these from a large amount of text, we already have we can build even like a word cloud. What's being regulated, who's being regulated, how strictly are they being regulated? And what do we find? More rules are governing low-level participants than high-level participants. A lot more. Well, you know, hey, come on. This is a little harder to interpret, but what this is saying is proportionally, people in authority positions are, when they're governed by a rule, they're governed more by a must and less by a may. Whereas participants, when they're governed, even though they're governed by more rules, they're governed essentially by weaker rules. You may, you can, you should. So add some nuance, a little bit. Ha!
You're right.
Do I keep going? How are we doing time?
8 minutes.
Yeah.
Gotta make a choice. Program for slides, you gotta make a choice.
I'm not making any choices.
But we'll ask you a question and take you to some of the slides that they've seen you go through. Right? That's the easy way.
Yeah.
Waddington surface.
What's that?
Waddington.
Yes.
Yeah. I got Waddington in there. Canalization. Because we're interested in. Well, maybe that would have been better background for the Wikipedia project, right? Yeah. Very good. What's the relationship between maturity and formalization? I'm not asking that. I think it's kind of a basic question, but it's what we were able to ask, and it's what we were able to ask at very large scale. What predicts the accretion of governance structure? This is a little bit of question in Wikipedia, but yeah, what correlates with just having more rules over time? When I say governance structure, I'm talking number of rules. What kinds of rules do communities use? This again is getting into rule type, not the institutional grammar, but some other workshop frameworks, the typology of rules and some other stuff. The regulative constitutive distinction. Do any of you use these things? Workshop? No. And are these predictors consistent across platforms? Are they general in the online domain at least? This is a population of thousands of servers on one platform, Minecraft, and this is the number of rules per server, written rules per server. And so you kind of have this sort of falling off distribution, which you have the same distribution across. Now the actual count of rules is a lot different. This World of Warcraft domain I described has huge policy manuals, whereas where Reddit is usually limited to like 10, and you kind of see the same distribution, but this is more interesting. Every dot is a community, okay? So this is what I mean by large-scale comparative institutional analysis. I'm showing this project less because of the results, more because we looked at 8,000 communities, and we're able to compare them under one systematic, standard analysis. To show, for example, that so the size of a community is related to we came up with different measures of success for every community. And more importantly, if you squint, we have rule count represented. And if you squint, at least the statistics show it, even if your squinting doesn't show it, more darker dots are in the upper corners. So you have more rules with size, more rules with success is the takeaway there. And then we're able to look at these, this was 500,000 rules under 80,000 communities. And we're able to show strategy norm requirement is that deontic strength, your may versus your must versus your can. So the smallest, so the yellow, This isn't that big. There is some variation across the yellows, across these 3 platforms. Those are all the strongest, you must. And then this is the weakest, you could. The purples, you could. But the biggest amount is you ought to, right? And so we're really seeing a pattern of setting expectations. Whereas down here, we have the constitutive regulatory. So a rule can regulate individual behavior, or a rule can sort of create the idea of an abstraction. You know, there will be a judiciary or whatever. This is the definition of the resource that all the other rules are governing. That's called a constitutive rule. And you see a lot less use of those compared to behavioral regulation. So what does it mean? I mean, yeah, I'm actually okay with this, that they're using rules less to set expectations than engineer incentive. I think that is a reflection of the results, and that's nice. And then I'll get into the actual paper I shared, which is, again, just showing the opportunities of looking at online communities. This time looking at polycentricity. So you can see there's lots of workshop frameworks and lots of workshop ideas that we're able to say something about using online communities. In this case, this is just very cursory. If you only skim the paper, we're interested in the axes or types of polycentric systems, and more particularly, there's lots of axes and types of there's lots of typologies of polycentricity. There's a bunch of them, and everyone, all kinds of people have something to say about it, but they're all focused on states, municipalities, and other like physical forms of governance. And I found them unsatisfying for looking at online communities. So if we expand the space of systems that can exhibit polycentricity, if we expand the space to include online domain, then the axes change. And what does that tell us? So this is a very qualitative project. There's no data here. Except our judgment. So we looked at a dozen platforms. Maybe you've heard of some of these, maybe you haven't. And then we're able to pull out these dimensions, which we justify in the manuscript. And again, this could be different. If someone came out in 2 months with a better one, I'd probably agree. I think there's a lot of room for improvement here, but at least we're trying to map out the design space of polycentricity, that it's not unidimensional, it's not 3-dimensional, but 12-dimensional is too much. What the online space really did, what I really appreciated about it is there are no clusters. It seems that every single of our 12 occupies a completely different part of the space. And that's really a reflection of how unexplored this design space is, and how hard it is to design for, but how much promise there is designing for multi-level systems. Polycentricity, if you don't know it, is a generalization of federalism or hierarchy or nesting of governance. And it's one of the implementations of things like subsidiarity. And it's one way of getting the best of hierarchy and centralization with a sort of bottom-up structure. That's the aspirations and ideals behind polycentricity that are expressed in a lot of platforms, better and worse. With all that, I can go to the end. Oh no, that wasn't so bad. I think a lot of the uses of workshop ideas in the online space have sort of followed forests, fisheries, water. But I think there's an opportunity, and so in a way, knowledge commons and digital commons has been a little bit more of a follower. But I think because of its access to really large numbers of communities at really fine individual level granularity with very complete like state data longitudinally, there's an opportunity for digital and knowledge commons to contribute and not just follow in the development of institutional analysis in general. That's my thesis. That's what I said last time. I'm still saying it, but in person this time. And so, yeah, I want to understand successful self-governance. I'm interested in very large scale quantitative comparative analysis as not the one tool to rule them all. I am very much motivated and driven by the cases I read, and those are I love. It was the workshop that showed me exactly how different methods complement each other. But I feel like this has been underrepresented because it's just so hard in physical space. And so this is the direction I'm pushing to complement everyone else's work here for developing institutional analysis. Institutional Grammar Research Initiative are the people developing computational tools for text analysis for institutional structure. This is a project for applying all of that to open source software umbrella organizations. There's 100 umbrella organizations managing thousands or tens of thousands of projects. This is a thing I do with Nathan here, meta governance. We're interested in the design and of online communities. We think it's great for its designability, iterability, frothiness. It's just a great, the online communities are great to do design on. And they put the IAD, institutional analysis and development, the development used to be design, and Lynn backed off from it into development. But I think we can be bold and try to get make the DB design again. And then another thing, and another thing, and another thing. Thank you.
Well, having another thing and another thing. I think you have one quick.
Oh, one in the chat.
Stop sharing so people, or maybe not, because maybe you'll
That's for me.
want your slide.
Actually,
Just a note from Doc.
Okay.
Okay, great. Actually, I never checked on the sound. Brian, have you been able to hear me this whole time? Okay, great.
Logging in.
Yeah.
Double check.
Oh, good. Good. Doc, do you have the, or was that a comment?
No, it's not a comment. It's a question. I'm wondering what, if you researched all these, what effects has your research had on them, on any of them?
With the it's all slow. It's about going to practitioner conferences. So I just went to one last month. It's called DWeb. It was run by archive.org. They're just a library. They have 90% of all books scanned now, and they take snapshots of the entire internet. So they're amazing. They're interested in decentralized, just further decentralization of the internet. And yeah, and so when I go to that kind of community, I say, oh, we don't really know anything and we're kind of useless. And they say, well, true, but no one else says either. So please tell us what to do. So I'll kind of reluctantly come up with stuff. And have I influenced any product? There's some people developing, they're interested in how does our platform help people write rules for themselves and what should that look like? And so we talk about that. Nathan can speak really well to that kind of thing. He's a little bit better on the helping people side of things than me, or at least that's what I say. What else? Apache, we're talking to. I haven't been doing this very long, so it kind of it takes time to really like change things. But what else? It's always like 1 degree away. I kind of want to feel, I don't know. I've been dissatisfied with the theory. I get, okay, there's this much strategy versus norm. There's this much information rule versus aggregation rule. Aggregation rules are really rare. Communication rules are important. There seems to be an important distinction between communication, like peer-to-peer rules versus broadcast rules. Like we normally say communication is communication, but those seem to always be distinguished by communities. And I have to be making all my theory up, all my predictions for my hypotheses up, because the literature is not helping me say, well, in this environment, you should have more communication rules. In that environment, you should have more firm top-down rules. And so I want more theory so I can make more. And once I feel like I'm making predictions and they're turning out to be right, rather than finding what's going on and trying to come up with hypotheses for it, which is just horrible scientific practice. Well, there's workarounds. Until then, I don't want to tell anyone what to do. But yeah, there's a need for theory, so please help. I have another point in there. There's a need for theory, so please help. Yeah. Question.
Brian was next.
Oh, Brian. Okay, great. Oh, Brian. Where's he gonna
Thank
come
you.
from?
Yeah. Fascinating stuff and lots of opportunity. So I'll agree with that. I'm going to ask a somewhat different question, which is coming out of work I'm trying to do right now on groundwater with Ruth Meinz and Dick. You talked about adopting rules because they were popular. So I guess, do you have ways of getting at or wrestling with the question of what if the rules aren't very effective and people are adopting because other people are doing it, or it shows they're actually doing something, and there may be opportunities to come up with better rules.
Yeah, this is good. We did the easiest thing that whole project we did in 2 weeks. It was a summer school. So we asked the easy question. To get into some of those, you need effectiveness, which you have to go really deep. Now, every single edit to every single Wikipedia article ever, back to 2009 is recorded. So like, not just the entire literal character by character history of all Wikipedias. So like, operationalize success with all data you could possibly imagine, and we can do it. Working with what I have, that was easy to get in 2 weeks. What I did, I opened theories of the policy process, Sabatier and Weibel. I opened up to policy diffusion chapter, and I went down all the theories of policy diffusion, which is policy spreading from one thing to another. It's mostly been used to theorize diffusion of policies around across the United States. And so, you're basing your policy off of geographically nearby, or are you basing off of states that are similar to you on some more like semantic or structural similarity, or you're following straight up popularity, or you're influenced by seeing success, which is different. So I just listed them all out. And we can actually test them all. And the answer is simultaneously great and disappointing. I think they're all true. So like, yes, policy diffusion. There's a point where your success becomes disappointing because you didn't learn anything. It's all true. But what do you expect? Everything affects everything. And some things affect everything more than others, and here we are.
Okay, but just for a quick follow-up, the question is how to get beyond the kind of positivist, this is what we can observe, and the interesting stuff that I know you're concerned about, design, self-governance, what opportunity is there for creativity and crafting, and how much does that help or not?
I think there's a lot, and if it seems like I'm minimizing the importance of those things, I'll fault myself by saying that my operationalizations of creativity are poor, and therefore they're not pulling the structure out of the data. So like, I'm open to that possibility. Maybe creativity doesn't matter. Maybe we just squashed it and we solved the whole thing. I don't think that's true. And this is why it's important to that this work is contributing to a dialogue of lots of people with lots of methods, so that we can continue refining my operationalizations to find something you didn't expect that you actually believe, as opposed to things you expect that you don't believe, and then and we get to improve together.
Thanks.
Chess was first, yes.
Cool. This is really interesting. I have 2 questions. One is to ask you to flip your thesis on its head.
Okay.
Just to say, you have successfully convinced me that this is a really incredibly fruitful area to start thinking about trying to get a broader theoretical understanding of self-governance. What are we losing? So the question being that it is relatively easy to design, come up with, and diffuse a whole wide range of norms and policies in what is a visible, well-recorded community, pretty much across the board of all the ones that you're looking at. You can observe when people violate them relatively easily. There's all sorts of things about, so all sorts of wonderful characteristics, but there's all sorts of things that make self-governance particularly difficult IRL. And so I'm curious about where, if you were to flip this on its head and say, okay, but here's what we're losing. I could imagine a whole lot of things that I come up with, but I think that you would probably have thought about this much more than I have. So I'm curious. That's my first question. The second is a slightly smaller data question about whether you observe sort of preferential attachment across different communities, right? In order to see policies exhibiting preferential attachment, you need multiple communities to be benefiting potentially. And so in the Wikipedia case, you need individuals to be reading multiple languages, right? But I'm curious if you observed that either in the Wikipedia case or in others, where the sort of more people have this policy or more communities have this policy, therefore it's more useful to have that policy, which would only be the case, right? If you're benefiting from multiple at the same time.
Yeah. So there's a slightly hellish thing that we think would be possibly possible, which is did these two vandalism policies get linked when this this like weird dialected German created the policy? So like, did they get linked upon creation? Versus did they both develop for a while and then get linked? And that's a little bit of what's driving your convergence. Is it copying or is it convergent evolution in the sense of solving the same problem? So rather than answer the question and kind of saying how I would answer it, we didn't go there because it sounds hellish for weird technical reasons. That they don't record everything. But yeah, it shows you can start to piece some of these things out, which I think is fun. The bigger question, yeah, I mean, I was trained as an experimentalist in the lab. And so one way that I make online communities palatable to social scientists is to say, well, don't think of it as a bad reality. Think of it as a really complicated lab setting, a really complicated experiment. And think of it as a lab setting that has all this unexpected richness, and I lost some causality and stuff, so I don't get to say this causes that, but I get to say like correlation. And so once you think of it that way, the amount of like institutional richness we're able to get, despite the fact that these people never meet, you know, and rarely talk synchronously, right? It's all asynchronous communication, like over weeks or whatever. The fact that we're still able to get something that has real stakes for people, and real, you know, actual subtractability and non-excludability, gives us a little bit of a leg to stand on to say that we're speaking to this. Now, I think I could probably argue really convincingly both positions that, well, all these ecosystems that have the tragedy of the commons are so different from each other that digital's not that different. I could argue that convincingly, and of course I could take myself down and say that, well, digital is really different than these other things. I don't think that. I could be convinced, and I don't blame you for thinking. But I can't argue it very well, actually. I think maybe you gave me too much credit there.
But even among those different ecosystems you mentioned, right? There's only certain kinds of things that they're better for studying than others, right?
I see.
So like, for instance, monitoring is a lot easier when your lobsters don't move, right? And so that's the kind of thing that I'm wondering about in the online community. What
Like,
are the dimensions that are more difficult that you lose out on
if I'm
the?
a monitoring person in fisheries, if I'm a and if I'm an X person, then it's irrigation. Is that true? I mean, like, do irrigation, like, and if I'm a forest person.
I don't know that it's true. I don't know that I would make that argument, but I would say that we, you know, if you could think about the no panacea as thinking about that, right? Which is that there's different characteristics to each of these systems that allow us to characterize them differently, and therefore consequently could study different parts of them.
I would say policy and trust is a lot harder than the other things. These tend to be really simple. But that's why we did our policy literacy project qualitatively. I would say that, but then I'll just push right back. Well, policy literacy is hard to study everywhere. So I want that to be true. I have to keep thinking about it. Yeah.
Gustavo and then Mike.
So my first comment or question is related to Shez's last point. It's I think it would be lovely if you can say more about how they enforce the rules, because I think collective action is mainly about different mechanisms, formal and informal, to enforce rules. And since you have the micro data to do that, that would be really nice. Yeah. So there are things to think about the long run path of development. I could do cherry picking. So essentially, why don't you focus on the unsuccessful cases or the very successful ones and see what happened? Yeah. Do they change? Do they, or the cases in which they have dramatic changes of rules? So exactly what characterize those cases? It's like, because you have large, the data is large, you can afford this cherry picking, okay? And then the final thing, I got challenged a little bit, this idea that the large scale thing comes at no cost. I think in some cases, I think it comes to a cost. The problem is that in some cases it's much cheaper to go out of this community and build a new one. which is very difficult to do in many real cases.
Oh, that's a huge thing.
So-
Exit is super cheap. And not just exit, but something some theorists call entrepreneurial exit, which is not just I can leave Facebook, I can leave Facebook and start another Facebook.
Yes, which I think is probably in those cases, but in the video games, that could be a very different thing. So I don't like this session community. Maybe it's not that expensive to leave and then build a new one. And I think that's changed the game a lot.
Yeah.
So, and then that I would be, if you ask me one dimension, which I would be worried, extracting information from this, I love this analogy with lab experiments, and then translate this to other physical cases or other cases. That is probably the key dimension for my perspective.
So if you want, I have looked, so in some cases I only get the successes and I don't get to see the failures. That's the case with Wikipedia policies. There's a lot of policies that don't get adopted a lot. But in the case of Minecraft, I got 300,000 servers. And among those, I narrowed it down to 5,000 that exhibit great variation. 2/3 of those 5,000 fail along some simple measure. And so you really are able to, it just pops out. It's this paper that gets into that. Another thing this paper does that you'll appreciate is I was looking really hard for some kind of democracy participation. I found nothing. It's all the most common rule further empowers the moderator, give them even more kinds of power. And a little bit the argument there is maybe, well, the argument I make in the paper back then a little bit is that because there's a market for tyrants, because you can leave your community very easily and join any other, that puts market pressure on moderators to act as if they're democratic. Now, I really don't like libertarian utopia. This is very Nozick. And so I was very reluctant to get there. That's my least bad explanation for what's going on. And Nathan has much better ideas about this.
But you can test hypotheses essentially there. You can start testing those hypotheses. That's the value of the.
And then what you're saying, so there's a really nice thing, Reddit is a great place to study rule change. So through a colleague, one of my co-authors students, we have 10 snapshots of 100,000 Reddit communities over a year and a half. And mostly the rules don't change at all. When they do change, it's pretty incremental. But sometimes they just rewrite their rules. So we're able to test, there's punctuated equilibrium theories of policy dynamics, which the important idea from biology over to policy change, which just, they say basically that really large changes to your institutional structure are going to be more rare according to some fat tail distribution that we'll be able to fit. And we'll be able to dive into more in terms of rule type and timing and so on. So there's opportunities to do those things. I feel like I just
The enforcement part.
handed you, but maybe
The first point you can say more about them.
oh yeah, there's good. Graduated sanctions are super ubiquitous. They're all over the place. Everyone's got the ban and everyone uses the ban and everyone tries not to. And if you use it too much, your users hate you and go somewhere else. And there's lots of and Reddit's engineering, like the place Reddit has put the most effort into developing its rule system is making it so when moderators are flagging non-compliant content, it's really easy for them to say what they did wrong. Linked to the rules. Which of these rules did you just violate? And they want to make it easy to give meaning, not just yes, no, bad post, good post, but you broke that rule. And so that I think also is the granularity, in my opinion.
It's a way of reducing the cost of imposing a punishment. So you have a problem of incentivizing people to punish the deviators, and that's what they are doing.
A little bit. It's super like it's moderate. Like we have different work showing how much moderators feel underappreciated for they're just volunteering, they're not getting paid, and they mostly get ragged on. And we have a nice interview study. We got 600 moderators from 600 communities, asking them, looking at the kind of social psychological. Daniel DeCaro has a bunch on the social psychology of the workshop. And he has some really nice frameworks for the kind of psychological prerequisites to being able to participate in sustainable resource management. And we're able to link to some of those in the online space. But that was a little bit us imposing a framework, because when we actually listen to the people, instead of like, tell me which dimension you're exhibiting, when we actually listen to them, they're saying that they feel really underappreciated and it's a lot of work and they kind of hate it, but they're sort of stuck.
Everything dies.
Mike's next, and then I want to give a heads up to if anyone else online, we're going to run out of time, and I have questions in the room, but obviously Seth is going to be here with the people in the room. So, but Mike was next.
Thanks, Seth. It's been a while since I've seen your work, and it's pleased to see you've been busy a bit. You're involved in a lot of different projects, and I find it very interesting. But I'd appreciate if you change to another slide. That thing's kind of driving me nuts here, looking at the screen. Thank you. I want to talk about your polycentric governance project. I know you said that this is something you just sort of started and you don't have as much data. And you expressed a little frustration that you ended up with, I think, 12 dimensions. Yeah, there it is. That sounds about right to me, you know. We had a project to try to muck up some definitions. We ended up with 8, so 12. You're pretty close to what.
Yeah, we were influenced by yours for sure. That was.
Yeah. So I mean that's pretty close. But I want to push you a little bit on, because you said you didn't think you thought in the paper you said you thought that polycentric governance didn't work as well in some of your online communities, because they're not as based on territoriality as the sort of real world governance systems are. And I'd like to push that logic a little bit further and recommend you look again at the Hoagie and Mark's distinction between type 1 and type 2 jurisdictions, where the type 2 was sort of the general jurisdictions, which are in real world sort of political sort of processes are almost always territorial, because that's where people interact. That's what kind of the structures of land the militaries can protect and laws can be enforced and stuff like that. And then type 2, which they said was a little more uneven and hard to get your mind around, was cross-sectional or cross-jurisdictional connections, which, as we know in polycentric governance, are really important. And so they're going to be connecting people who do similar kinds of jobs, but are remotely sort of set up and something like that. And I think that it's fair to say polycentric governance really has this grounding in federalism, which itself has this grounding in sort of geographic or territorial collectiveness. That's the way sort of states and communities are put together. But I'm wondering if in your communities, your online communities, what would be the equivalent of territoriality in some of these different communities that would sort of be the most obvious way in which groups interact with each other? I don't know if it would be you know, but so do you have any thoughts on whether there would be some sort of a hierarchy in how you might apply similar dimensions to these online communities?
It would be semantics. It's two communities are physically close to each other if they're about the same thing. And you see it really clearly in Reddit, where two communities that do the same kind of thing slightly differently will have a lot of the same users and sometimes some of the same moderators. And so there's your diffusion mechanism and your influence mechanism, and your hierarchy.
Okay, sounds reasonable. And the diffusion literature does try to capture some of that, but you're right, it does tend to focus on states or nations sort of thing. But that's interesting.
Anyone else online? Because otherwise I'm going to go into the room. Okay. Brittany's been quiet. It's not usually the case.
I'm really interested in the language dimensions you brought up in the Wikipedia project. I'm surprised that language wasn't a larger point, especially since the different Wikipedias are organized around language, by cultural identity. And I'm curious if you saw any difference in the ways that language exists in, like, language online is really different from language in territorial space, in that like English plays a really large role. And maybe that's not the same for like the former French colonies. So yeah, just curious if you saw language online be any different, and you hinted that you take sort of an anti-Worfian position that you don't think it's going to end up being significant. So I'd love to hear more about that. And then a second thought is I'm curious what role gender plays in this, because I experience these places as supermask and sometimes anti-men. And so and that's not necessarily different from the territorial world, but Like, how does that play into your analysis?
For the last question, what I'll say is how I would answer it, which is Reddit suffers from both those things, but it does have pretty good bubbles of supporting all kinds of gender communities. And so I would try to go kind of granularity, like here's 100 that do a really good job of supporting these kinds of people and those kinds of people, and those kinds of people. I think Reddit is okay for that. It has a ton of toxic stuff and it has a ton of beautiful stuff. It's just big, you know? So I'll say a lot, like this Photoshop made good design better and bad design worse. And I think that generally about technology, that it makes the good better and the bad worse. And so a lot of these other communities, yeah, they're very male dominated. Minecraft is like 85% boys, you know? But Reddit's going to be less bad than the others for that. On the, yeah, I was raised as a Whorfian, you know, cog sci, like Berkeley cog sci is all like language first. So I can say basically why I'm wrong, which is going to be first, there's a million cases that say there's like, if you actually just look at any two Wikipedias that have some, let's say, colonial relationship, you'll see you'll see a connection, even though we're not able to see it in the data. So so it's going to come about good operationalizations. You'll just see it. It's like you can't miss it. Gujarat doesn't just translate the English language vandalism policy, they paste it in English. The English language. So it's like a bunch of Gujarat on top, bunch of Gujarat on bottom, and then just the English, like right there it is. So like there, you know, there it is. Can I answer that question? Oh yeah, here's a really good point that you want to keep in mind is that just because they both have, we detect that two communities both have a vandalism policy. We do not detect that those vandalism policies are the same or different. So we're getting that they're identifying policy challenges in roughly the same order. We are not getting any, we can say nothing about whether they're converging on how they're solving those problems. So that's probably your wiggle room for culture to have a huge role. If I was gonna guess.
Can you speak just quickly? Have you done anything on the power?
Pretty quickly.
Yeah, very quickly, which I appreciate. Can you, I think part maybe hidden in there a little bit was, have you done any research on how often the moderators repeat themselves? So there's a power dynamic.
Themselves.
So there's a moderator who does X, but then also because they sort of trickle into speaking multiple languages or exist in multiple communities, it's the same group of moderators, just one different person in charge, you know, in a different space.
Yeah, so this isn't my work, but they're called supermods.
Yeah.
It turns out that most traffic on Reddit, yeah, so it's not true actually that Reddits are only tied by their semantics. The biggest Reddits are all tied by the fact that they're the biggest. So if you look at them, if you go to Reddit, you can click around, you'll find the moderators. And if you do that for like the top 10, you'll see surprising overlap. There's a very small number of volunteer human beings moderating a lot, like in terms of proportion of content, moderating like a very large proportion of what goes through it. So there's yeah, super mods are like individuals who like run 100 subreddits. Yeah, and that fact has been detected, but doing cool stuff with it in terms of governance style or whatever hasn't been. I don't know. We'd have to talk about like how to really do that in a way that we get something that we trust, but it's there.
Oh yeah, I have two questions, but I think we're out of time, so let's just ask one. So thinking about theory, you kind of posted some network analysis stuff earlier, which we kind of didn't dwell on. One thing I've been thinking about for a while in relation to IAD and the general framework is there isn't really much incorporation of peer-to-peer networks and the way that network theory can kind of enter into that area. It seems really highly relevant to some of the communities you're looking at.
Yeah, like
Is that a theory you have explored or how that ties into your empirical analysis at all?
I guess I mean, so you know the Bell Ecology of Games? Okay, all right. So what, maybe repeat the question. What's the peer-to-peer, is that a theory or that's like a structure? I think that's an architecture.
Yeah, sorry, it's a bad question. There's like a whole suite of network theories in sociology that's related to peer-to-peer interaction. And that hasn't really been integrated into this framework side of things. Like everything that's network related is kind of more at the organizational level or action situation level, which doesn't cleanly map onto like a Reddit community.
Yeah.
per se. I'm wondering if like you see ways for the theory to develop along network lines and if that's promising.
Yeah, I think I would go to like Weibel and Tanya Heikela. They've done a lot of the applying network theory to like to create a network of policies linked by like and then there's some, and they did a good job linking basic like centrality, network centrality measure to some theory. That's good. There's a project of one of my students I'm super proud of. I think she did a really amazing job. We use complex network analysis, which is to say, multiplex networks is the idea that there's multiple ways a community can be linked. You can be linked on the fact of sharing traffic. You can be linked on the level of sharing this type of rule and how many of this type of rule you share and that type of rule, that type of rule. So think like the same 5,000 or 1,500 nodes, but there's 5 networks that because of the different ways they're connected, okay? And then what you're able to do is you sort of have a null model that these are independent of each other. And so because our null model knows what how they would change if they were changing independently, if there's any deviation from that null model, we can start to say causal things like a change in this type of rule caused change in that. And specifically what we looked at, we were interested, there's a lot of homophily, which means that if people tend to go, if a group tends to go to the same 10 servers, then those 10 servers will have the same types of rule composition. And so then you have a nice like what causes what? Is it, well, these are all governed the same way, so they attract the same kind of people? Or is it, well, the same kind of people go to these places, so administrators adapt by giving them the same types of rules. And so we were able to use a nice complex network measure to make a causal argument that it was one of the two. I think institutional structure is driving what kind of people you get rather than the other way around. Yeah. So that's 2 examples of the use of network. I think there's a lot more to do. I made a decision very early in my career to avoid network science because it's very like done to death. And I think there's a lot to do elsewhere. But all my peers, especially coming out of complex informatics, were in it, and of course sociology. And so I'm conversant enough to see when it's the right tool for the job.
We're at the top of the hour. So for those of you here online, thank you for joining us. Obviously, as always, we're gonna, those of you who still have questions, right? There's food. Seth has agreed to stay. We're incredibly fortunate. Actually, your afternoon group is all here as well. But before we officially dismiss, please give Seth a massive round of applause. We'll shut this off. That's what's gonna happen.
Yeah.
Drive him nuts.
Have you done a lot with the metaverse stuff yet?
No, I think it's kind of talk to a person who's in charge of designing and governance, and he doesn't know what to do.
We're starting like what everyone needs for experience for us.
Great.
General overview book. So proposing one of the metaverse. If that goes through, I would love to.
I can find the people.